Hey y'all, and everyone else out there in the multiverse. Welcome back to Room 66, where every week we will be diving deep into the paranormal and listening to experiences from our guests. Today's video is a true story from a user who has probably had one of the scariest stories we have ever had to read, and just goes to show that sometimes the monsters we read about are all around us. My experience in the rural Oregon mountains. When I would hear the old saying, right place at the right time, I'd think to myself, yeah, okay, it's all just coincidence. But after what I've been through these past 6 weeks, my mind is changing. Maybe you are put in a specific place at a specific time for a reason. But I digress. As most of you know, the PNW, Pacific Northwest, for those unfamiliar, was recently ravaged by an ungodly amount of wildfires. Seeing all the little fire emojis dotted all over maps of California, Oregon, and Washington made my heart ache. My home was burning. Fortunately for myself and my family, our area hadn't been hit as hard as many others. I had planned a camping trip a few weeks prior to this pandemic of fires, so I was happy to see that my usual spot was not near any major fires and subsequently had been deemed safe to travel and camp in. I am a camping enthusiast and enjoy deep wilderness camping. My usual spot is fairly remote. It requires a 2-hour drive up a 2-lane road into the middle of nowhere, followed by a 30-minute drive up an old lodging road that ultimately caressed a small mountain. The mountain slope leads into a beautiful valley, with much larger mountains encircling the valley from the north and east. In the center was a decently sized clearing. The clearing was littered with fallen logs, beautiful pink and yellow yarrow flowers, and the occasional family of white-tailed deer. This was my true happy place. This valley has a name, but I will keep it hidden for anonymity purposes. I left on a Tuesday morning in early September. The drive to the mountain was relatively uneventful, besides almost hitting a large buck who decided to cross the road right in front of my truck. I arrived on the mountain crest on schedule and began unpacking the bed of my truck. I had just recently bought a brand new 2020 Toyota Tacoma. I parked my truck facing the clearing, roughly 5 feet from the edge of a small drop-off. The slope down to the valley wasn't steep and is fairly easy to hike down. I'd say it's about 400 to 450 feet from where I parked down to the start of the valley floor. I had camp set up just as dusk was setting. I usually would have large fire going, but with the previously mentioned wildfires, that was not possible. I brought a small propane stove and a space heater to prevent any accidents. As I finished gulping down my last bite of dinner, I noticed it was quickly growing dark. I hopped off my tailgate and made my way to my driver's side door. As I was digging in my pockets for my keys, I looked down into the valley and noticed something strange. I could make out 2 small, circular lights in the far distance. They flickered as they quickly moved closer into the clearing. It looked as if they were hovering and navigating through the trees at a steady pace. I crouched down in front of my truck and looked on in curiosity. I watched for a few minutes until the lights eventually arrived at the tree line of the clearing. I could hear the humming of motorcycle engines echoing from the valley. That's when I realized what I was staring at. What on earth were these 2 people doing riding dirt bikes out here? This was the first time I had ever seen another person out here. The lights were stationary at this point. I assumed the 2 riders were off their bikes and walking around the clearing. Although, that is only speculation, as I couldn't see anything aside from the 2 bike headlights. I knew they couldn't see me, as I had no visible lights on or a campfire. I instantly thought to grab my phone out of my glove box. Local news stations warned the public of suspected people intentionally starting fires in the woods. They encouraged citizens to be vigilant and gather any evidence that they could. In an absolute lapse in judgment, I pressed the unlock button on my keys. My truck lights flashed and a loud beeping sound rang out. I had just given a beacon of my location to these midnight riders. In a rush of adrenaline, I threw myself on the ground, stomach first. My mind was screaming, "Good going, Einstein." I could barely think as my heart was pounding in my ears. I watched as the bike lights began to turn back into the direction they came from, and eventually disappear into the darkness. I could hear the engines revving harder than they had before. That unsettled me a bit. As I stood up and brushed myself off, I began to think about how odd it was. Usually people with good intentions do not run off like that when they notice other campers. These people were obviously up to no good down there. Maybe drug traffickers, meth cookers, arsonists? My mind was filled with all the potential threats I might have alerted to my location. I sat in my truck and mulled over my options. Should I drive home? What if they were waiting for me at the end of the lodging road? Was I overreacting? I decided to pack up camp and spend the night in my truck and drive home first thing in the morning. After packing up, I drove down the lodging road a little ways and backed into a small gap into the mountain face. That way, if the midnight riders decided to pay me a visit, they might miss me. I was in full paranoia mode. I lowered my seat back, racked around into my handgun, and eventually dozed off as the adrenaline turned into exhaustion. I awoke to my alarm with "My Life for Hire" by ADTR blaring from my phone. In a groggy daze, I sat up and rubbed my eyes. My phone said 6:32 a.m. Looking out my windshield, I could see thick brown smoke swirling in the wind. As I stepped out of the truck, I was hit with the intense smell of burning wood. As you guessed, there was a fire very close by. I jumped back into my truck and raced back up the mountain. From my camping spot, I'd be able to get a better understanding of the situation. As I drove way too fast up this narrow lodging road, I noticed the smoke was thinning out as my elevation grew. My heart sank at this realization. When I reached the crest, I jumped into the truck bed and looked over into the valley. I could see blue skies above the mountains across from me to the north and east. My heart sank as this confirmed my suspicion. I turned towards the lodging road to my right, and I could see smoke thicken from that direction. I was trapped. My mind instantly went to the two riders from the previous night. I grabbed my phone, praying for a signal. Of course, no luck. I jumped off my truck bed and threw my passenger door open. I frantically searched for my backpack. I ripped it apart. Once I found it, looking for my GPS satellite phone. I kissed it with joy when I grabbed it from the bottom of the bag. I flipped it open and thanked the Lord I had a signal. I called 911 to report the fire and request help. I chatted with the operator for about 15 minutes. The operator said that she'd contact the local wildland and firefighting companies and attempt to get a helicopter to evacuate me. After being on hold for a few minutes, I was transferred to a helicopter pilot with a wildland firefighting company that was nearby. I mentioned the valley name, and the man said he knew where it was. He claimed they were sending a helicopter to pick me up, and that I needed to be there and ready to leave as soon as they landed. After we disconnected, I rushed to clear out my truck of any valuables. I sadly rubbed the dashboard and said, "sorry," to my new truck, as it was evident the fire would eventually consume her. And then I gradually started making my way down the slope into the valley. After only falling a few times, I reached the valley floor. I bolted through the trees and towards the clearing. My lungs were on fire as I neared the clearing. As I broke through the tree line, I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. After a few minutes of laying there, catching my breath, I got back onto my feet. I started walking towards the center of the clearing. When I got to what I assumed was the center, I glanced up at the peak of the small mountain. I could see my bright red truck sitting where I left it. Roughly 200 feet to the left of it was a wall of fire. Black smoke was rising from the wall as it raced up the mountain. I turned away, not wanting to watch $39,000 literally go up in flames. I began scanning the skies, searching for my rescue. I concentrated on listening for the chopping sound of a helicopter's rotors. As I stood there just listening, I could hear something else that made me question my sanity. Just to my left, I could hear someone crying. A shockwave ran through me. I stood there unable to believe my ears. I upholstered my handgun and called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" I then began to hear muffled screaming. I ran towards the screaming, trying to hold back tears. I noticed a piece of plywood roughly 4 feet wide by 8 feet long, covered in branches and dirt. It was laying on the ground with a large boulder set on top. I called out, "Hello?" I heard the muffled scream again, this time much louder and unmistakable. Is someone really under this plywood? I thought to myself. I rushed to move the boulder. After struggling for a few minutes, I finally managed to push the boulder off the plywood. I slowly lifted it up and threw it to the side. What I saw is something I will never forget. Sitting inside a small hole probably no bigger than 4 feet by 4 feet was a woman. Her wrists were zip-tied and her mouth was gagged by a piece of cloth. I gasped and took a step back. I couldn't believe it. What the hell was going on? The woman was frantically looking around. I snapped out of my shock and rushed to help her. She flinched as I reached out to grab her. I lifted her out of the hole, and I took the cloth from her mouth, and she frantically started yelling in Spanish and raising her arms. I told her, "Calm down, you're safe now." I cut the zip ties that were binding her wrists. She instantly started pointing behind me and repeating, "Mi niña." I didn't understand, as unfortunately I spoke no Spanish. I turned around quickly to see 4 more pieces of plywood scattered across the clearing. I was horrified. I rushed over and started to flip them over one by one, they were empty. The woman following me as I did this let out a painful cry as I flipped the last piece of plywood, exposing a 4th and final empty hole. She collapsed on the ground and began sobbing. I tried to ask her what was wrong, but I couldn't understand her. As I attempted to console her, I could hear the distant sound of helicopter rotors. I looked up to see the chopper descending into the valley. I helped the woman up and put her arm over my shoulder as we rushed to the waiting chopper. A man jumped out from the side doors. When we reached him, he helped the woman in and then stopped and yelled, "You didn't tell us that there was 2 of you." I yelled back, trying to be heard over the loud rotors, "I just found her. I have no idea what's happening." He replied with, "You found her? What are you? Never mind, we don't have time. Get in." He helped me into the copter and shut the doors. Soon after, we started to ascend. I looked down over the valley to see the fire had engulfed the peak and was halfway down the slope towards the valley. I sat back in relief. I was finally safe, but I had so many questions. The state police and EMTs met us when we landed back at the base camp. I explained the entire situation, and they took the woman and I back to the station. Eventually, I was released after retelling my story to 6 different officers. My wife picked me up, and I was able to return home. That wasn't the end of it, unfortunately. Over these last 6 weeks, I've been interviewed by local authorities, state authorities, the U.S. Marshal, ICE, and even a pair of FBI agents. My final interview was with the 2 FBI agents. They were the only ones who gave me any real information on the situation. After retelling my story, just as I did here, they filled in some holes for me. They explained that I most likely stumbled upon a human trafficking operation. When I unlocked my truck, it spooked them. He said I was lucky I hid in the gap when I did, as they most likely went up the lodging road to handle me. When they couldn't locate me, they probably assumed I had left to get the police, so they packed up any valuable assets, including the woman's young daughter, and started the fire to destroy any evidence before I could alert the authorities. I asked about the girl. The older agent informed me that her and her daughter were kidnapped from Nicaragua. The woman claimed that they were set to be sold to someone in Russia. She was being held in government custody until she can be returned home. He then said, "She's lucky you came along when you did. You were at the right place at the right time." Hey all, thanks for tuning in. If you want to subscribe, head over to the door below. You can find us on YouTube at Room 66. We also run Sinister Soaps. If you're interested in sinister scented soap, you can check us out at sinistersoap.com. Enjoy the rest of your stay at Room 66.